just kindergarten.
Good evening or good morning. You think I have an entire week to prepare for my opening statement and I mess it all up. Good morning, everybody. We're in James 1, if you want to jump over to that. I am getting old. Can't you see all these gray hairs? I could say something back, I'm not going to. Yeah, James chapter 1, as you can tell, we're going to be jumping around with James 1. This is the part of the quarter where we kind of maybe get a little bit more minute. We're going to be looking at 2 verses in James 1. Jump over to James chapter 4. Next week is the one that we take a behemoth section. I think we take 15 something odd verses. So there's going to be a lot of stuff that we'll discuss next week. But we're going to begin with James chapter 1, and I'm going to ask Brother Joe Kurt, if he doesn't mind, to lead us in a word of prayer.
Our Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for this day, the first day of the week, for this opportunity that we have this morning to assemble together and study and worship you. We pray that we're about to end this worship service this morning, and our hearts and minds will be receptive to the things that are said, the songs that will be sung. We pray, Father, that you be with Brother Brady, who he's about to lead us in this study this morning. The sermon that he's prepared this morning will be one that will be beneficial to each and every one of us. We ask, Father, that you give each of us wisdom that we might make decisions in this life to avoid the mistakes and heartbreak of making poor decisions. We ask now that you'll forgive us for our sins, Father. We repent of the shortcomings. Guide, guard, and direct us throughout this life. Help us to live a life that's humble in humility. For these things we ask in our loving Savior's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Since it feels like eternity since we've studied James, we'll do a brief recap real quick. Let's look at James chapter 1 and verses 12 down to verse 15. What does he talk about in those verses? James 1 verses 12 through 15. This is a section we discussed 2 weeks ago. Right. Exactly. Blessed is the man who endures temptation, which is not an unusual theme. He discussed that in verses 2 through 4. That's kind of the big, famous passage. Consider all joy, my brother. Howard, were you going to say something?
I was going to say that that is a common thing, but usually the way persecuted or sometimes we have self-pity on our and we do everything except remember what he said.
Right.
These are good for us.
Right. Yeah, and you're exactly right. That's sometimes a hard thing for us to kind of encapsulate the idea that persecution, trials, and temptations can actually be good for us in some form or fashion. As you mentioned, we're used to thinking of it in terms of negative. I think Russ talked about that a little bit last week, but that's kind of what he details so far in James chapter 1. As you mentioned, he mentions in 2 through 4, he mentions in verse 12. What else does he discuss, though, in those sections, in those verses 12 through 15? Right, that God is not... Right, that God is not responsible for tempting us. Exactly. Why do you think James feels the need to kind of bring that statement up? Why does he touch on that?
Well, back then, there was a lot of persecution going on.
Right.
And it's like I said earlier, times past, that's what why God, why are you letting this happen to us?
Right.
And what he's pointing out to them is God is not letting this happen.
Right.
But they're going to go through it. It's just a matter of natural nature course.
Right.
You know?
Exactly.
So he's encouraging them to persevere through it, keep the faith, be strong,
Right.
and you'll get through it.
Yeah, and that's kind of the big thing. And what you said there, I think, is really the biggest issue of all of it, is that we sometimes ascribe temptation directly to God. God is the one that's tempting me, and that's not true. God is not the one that's tempting me. He sometimes allows temptation to take place, which is where you harmonize with in the Old Testament when God says that he tested Abraham or things like that. It's not that he himself is just kind of playing, trying to be mean or whatever to Abraham, but he allows us to go through temptations. And so you kind of see that here in this passage. The common idea, though, as you mentioned, is if I'm going through these negative things, then that has to be as a result of God. And that's kind of the thing that he destroys. He mentions there in verse 16, as he gets to the end of this, and this is kind of piggybacking off of what Joe said, he said, don't be deceived, my beloved brethren. The temptation is that God is the one causing it, but he doesn't want us to be deceived. Why does he not want us to be deceived because of that? Why does he not want us to be deceived thinking that God is the source of temptation, trial, sin, all that stuff?
If we blame God, then we don't fix ourselves.
Right. If we can blame God and kind of shuffle it off, then we don't have to blame ourselves. Yeah. Why else does he not want us to be deceived?
You completely lose your focus and you end up falling into the trap where you become a worldly person.
Right. You fall into a worldly person, you just kind of say, well, if this is God doing it to me, then this is obviously my lot in life. And you see that a little bit with, not to kind of dovetail, or not to go on a complete tangent, but you see that sometimes with the homosexuality debate. This is the way that God has made me, therefore I have to act in the way that God has created me. That's not in God's nature, and that's not what God does. Exactly.
Yeah, it sounds like it puts you in a state of spiritual dissonance of where you recognize God as the creator, should be worshipped, should be praised, and at the same time, he's the one throwing all this bad stuff at us. So
Right.
those are two very big incongruencies, and in the exact example you gave, a lot of Christians who do end up coming out as homosexual or something like that, that's just an example. Anything could fit in there.
Right.
What do they end up doing? They end up staying faithful. More likely than not, they don't, because they're sitting here with this incongruency of going, why would God do this, yet he's the one I'm supposed to be worshiping, yet he's the one bringing me all of the suffering that I am going through.
Right.
So
The Bible says blank, but God created me this, and there's that, as you mentioned, there's that dissonance. So how do you reconcile those two? Well, I have to stay true to my feelings, and that puts you basically in the place of God. Yeah, Howard?
I think the scriptures tell us in so many words that God is not tempted. He allows us to be
Right.
tempted. And there's a difference there.
Right.
And we might not understand it all, but there's a difference.
I would wager we probably don't understand hardly any of it. I mean, it's easy for us to armchair quarterback the whole thing and say, well, if I was God, I wouldn't do blank. When the reality is we don't know hardly anything of God's doing. Some of the secret things belong to God. You can look at Isaiah 55, his ways are higher than my ways. So all of that kind of is in play there. What else does he mention, though, in verses 12 down to verse 15? What does he say about the nature of sin? Because this is another kind of big statement or big argument he makes here.
Enticed by our own lust or desires.
Exactly. In contrast to God being the one that entices us, where does sin originate?
Within ourselves.
Exactly. And if sin originates within ourselves, where does the onus belong to fix it? Ourselves, exactly. And that's where I think Russ mentioned this. He danced all the way around James, and I don't know if he was going to hit on this. But when you look down at verse 22, he talks about prove yourselves doers of the word, not merely hearers who delude themselves. If you view your natural face in the mirror, you turn away, you're just kind of deluding yourself. The onus is on us to fix the issues that are in our lives. And so that's what we need to be doing. But he mentioned this here in verse 16, don't be deceived, my beloved brethren. Sin doesn't come from God. Sin comes from when we're drawn away by our own lusts and enticed. And we kind of put this verse 16 at the end of verses 12 through 15. I think it goes both ways. I don't think that verse 16 just applies to the previous verses. I think it applies to the end of this. If you look at verses 17 and 18, and you read verse 16 kind of in harmony with that, he says, don't be deceived, my beloved brethren, for every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. That's a very eloquent verse we'll discuss here in a second. And the exercise of his will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. There's a lot in those two verses. It's kind of easy to just shoot right past them, move on to this stuff. But what is he talking about now in verses 16 down through verse 18?
Well, it's the contrapositive argument to what he just made in 12 through 15.
Right.
That if God does not tempt us, and it's our own fault, God does provide us all the good things that aren't really our responsibility either. All that good stuff that we
Right.
might attribute to our good deeds and what we've done, those are coming from God. That's not you.
Right. And it's easy for us to think that it is coming from us, and that's where we see the companion passage in James chapter 4 that we'll discuss here in a second. But you're exactly right. It's a kind of a counter-argument to what he mentions in 12 through 15. Just like you can't say that God is the source of all evil, the argument to that is, or the counterpoint to that is, God is the source of all good. By the very nature of who he is, he cannot be evil, he cannot tempt. His nature is good, he's the kind of the originator of all that stuff. Yeah. What else? Yeah.
Verse 15 is very clear. You just take time to read it. In that Satan does the tempting. We're the one that commits sin.
Right.
So it's a two-part formula to get to the sin, and we're the second part of the formula. We're the one
exactly. At the end of the day, it's still on us to kind of go through with the act. Yeah, we're drawn away by our own lusts and enticed. I think that's a good illustration. Yeah. Why do you think he brings this up in verses 16 through 18? Why do you think he puts these kind of side by side? What's the temptation for us sometimes? Why does he say it's on you whenever we are drawn away by our own lusts and enticed, but then also say it's not on you when these good things just kind of seem to come out of nowhere? What is he trying to get us to realize?
Our dependency.
Right, our dependency on God, exactly. What do we tend to think sometimes? Look what I did, or look what I created for myself. The problem with that is what? When we start thinking, look at what I did, look at what I've created, what's the tendency to think?
We tend to put God in the fallback. We can act on our own, but if something goes wrong, then we fall back to God to take care of it.
Right, exactly.
Completely reversed.
Right. Humanity's default is everything evil I'll ascribe to God, everything good I'll ascribe to myself. What James does is essentially flip that script. If we're doing something evil, it's because we want to do it. That's the reason we engage in sin in the first place. But when something's good, it originates from God because He is the originator of good. Everything that we have in this life, and that's not to diminish the aspect of work. I'm not sitting here saying that whether you're lazy or whether you work, good things are just going to come to you no matter what. But all good things come from God, and that's what we need to be thankful for in the first place. When you look at verse 17, this is one of those verses I think that's, verse 18. When you look at verse 18, this is one of those verses I think that's very interesting. What is he saying here in verse 18? That was not the right. Let's go back to verse 17, I'm sorry. I only got 5 hours of sleep last night, so I'm a little bit tired, so if I seem loopy, that's why. Look at verse 17. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. What he does in this verse is kind of akin to what he does in verse 15. Talks about the nature of sin, talks about the kind of the origination of all this. So when you look at verse 17, he's kind of talking about the nature of God. What are some things he says about God in verse 17?
Well, two things primarily. The first is that every good gift comes from God.
Right.
We got that part.
Mm-hmm.
But also that God does not shift.
Mm-hmm.
What He says He is and will be.
Right.
He's not going to change.
Right.
Which carries into 18,
Mm-hmm.
that if we follow Him,
Mm-hmm.
we will be like Him, and that's what He wants.
Right. Ultimately, as we've mentioned several classes before, ultimately our aim is to be kind of the perfect Christian, to be molded into the image, or molded into the image of God. And by perfect, we don't necessarily mean sinless, we mean complete, molded in the image of Him. So yeah, to understand if we're going to be in His image, we have to understand who He is. And so I think, as you mentioned, especially as He mentions at the end of verse 17, there is no variation or shifting shadow. That's kind of a very eloquent phrase to say the simple statement that God doesn't change. Why is it important that God doesn't change? And there's verses that describe this all over the place. I think Malachi 3:5 is one of the big ones. I do not change, God explicitly says.
Well, if He changes, we'd never be able to try to become complete in His sight.
Right. It's kind of like trying to hit a moving target. Right. It's like trying to hit a moving target on the run with the blow dart. I mean, there are all sorts of kind of, I don't know why I chose blow dart there, but there's all these kind of variables that can impact it, yeah. So it's important to know that He doesn't change because we need to be molded in His image.
Well, you can't trust a promise that He makes, because at one
Right.
point He could be an honest and good God, and on another hand He could be a trickster God.
Right.
So if He's constantly changing His nature, every promise He makes and then swears by an oath that He'll uphold that promise means nothing, because
Right.
he could have changed His mind by then.
Right. Exactly, and I think that's the main idea he's getting at. I think what Joe said is a part of it, but I think the idea of his promises being sure is a big part of it too. Because what James wants us to understand throughout the course of chapter 1 is that God is sure that He fulfills His promises, that we can trust in Him. Has He already talked about this idea in James chapter 1 so far? Where has He talked about it? Next got the right answer, but I'll leave it to everybody else to say where. Where does He talk about it? I'll give you a hint, it's before verses 17 and 18. It really doesn't narrow it down. Where does he talk about this surety of God's promises in this chapter?
I will promise us that.
Exactly. Verses 5 through 7. He kind of revisits that same theme here in verse 17, 18. If any of you lacks wisdom, verses 5 through 7, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously without reproach. It will be given to him. Verse 6, but he must ask in faith without any doubting. For the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. If God is a God of change, if he's always kind of changing his personality, if he's always changing his promises, what does that do to our relationship with him? The fact that he's steadfast is one of the core principles of Christianity.
We genuinely need to know that we can have confidence.
Right.
In God,
Mhm.
that we can depend on Him.
Right. Old, right.
And to be true to what He just said,
Right.
and to know that that's not going to vary.
Right. Ultimately, as you mentioned, ultimately it kills our reliance on him. How can I trust him because X, Y, and Z? And that's one thing you see in the Old Testament. God says over and over again, and that's why that phrase is repeated over and over again. God does not change. The Jews change, but God does not change.
He also says he's not a God of confusion.
Right, 1 Corinthians 14, right. He's not a God of confusion. He's not somebody who tries to stir up dissension or kind of chaos just because. Yeah, I think that's a good point. What else do you see about God here in verses 17 and 18? If we can hit all three of these in order, that would be the first time ever. Awesome. What else do we see about God in 17 and 18?
Everything's done by His will. It wasn't by any, it wasn't by the angels.
Right.
You don't have a vote. It's His will. That's all.
Right. He does what he wants. It's his will. That's number 3, so we're almost there. But you're right. I think you do see that in verse 17, 18. He's the ultimate one in authority. He's the one that's calling the shots. I think that's a big part of that. What else do you see in verses 17 and 18? What do you think he means when he says not only there's no variation, but no shifting shadow?
What you were just talking about.
Yes, that's true, yes. But think about what does that phrase shifting shadow mean? Because variation is one thing, and he's not repeating himself necessarily. Why do you think he uses the phrase shifting shadow? Shifting shadow.
Maybe kind of a mystery or unknown. Unable to define what that means. The shadow really has no definition.
Right, so it's hard to define, it's hard to kind of nail down what he is. I think that's it, yeah. Let me ask you this, what is he, Jeffrey?
I always think of watching baseball getting late, in the evening, you can see the shadow kind of
Yes.
creep across the field.
Mm-hmm.
So, the shadows move based on structures we built.
Right. Yes, that's true.
Something's always on the move.
Right, things are always moving, and that's kind of where you see the similarity with variation, yeah. Let me ask you this, what does he call God in verses 17 and 18? The Father of lights, exactly. Why do you think he calls him the Father of lights? It's not to say that his house is lit up around the holidays. Right, where there's light, there is no darkness. I think that's part of it, Lee.
I was fixing to bring up the subject about him being Father of life, which is knowledge,
Right.
understanding, and everything. And in shifting shadows, you can't always know what knowledge is.
Right, that's true too.
But correct.
Right. And that's still a little bit with variation. If knowledge is changing, if it's all subjective, then you don't really know what you're going for. I think that's true too. I think a lot of it goes back to what Jeff mentioned. When you look at the sun inevitably moves. Well, the sun doesn't move. Never mind. 7th grade biology. The sun does not move, but to us it appears to move throughout the sky. But what happens half the day?
There's shadows.
There's shadow. There's darkness. Exactly. So when you look at what he mentions in verse 17 by calling him Father of lights, and he talks about shifting shadows, I think ultimately what he's talking about is how he doesn't ever rest. He doesn't ever take a day off. Lights sometimes go away, you have darkness, but there's no shifting shadow. There's no time change where he just kind of takes a few hours off. And so not only does God not ever change, he also doesn't ever go away, which is a huge positive for us. Because if God doesn't ever go away, what does that do to our faith? What does that do to the faith of a persecuted Christian? What do we know? He's always there, exactly. Now, in persecuted Christians' case, what kind of confidence does that give them? They know that no matter the darkest time of their life, no matter the darkest times of persecution, what? God's always there, exactly. There's no variation, there's no shifting shadow, there's no change, there's no rest. And then you go with what Paul mentioned, where he says he basically does what he wants. And that's not to say that he acts in opposite towards us, where he just kind of plays, mean and he's chaotic. If he does what he wants and his nature is good, then what does that mean for us?
Steady anchor.
Right, that he's a steady anchor, that he's always going to be there. Yeah.
Well, it also reflects his love for us, because if every good thing or everything we receive from him, because at the beginning of the verse it identifies that those are gifts. So he doesn't have to give anything. It says entirely at his own volition that he's doing this. But he's giving good gifts and he's giving perfect gifts.
Right.
And if he does what he wants, and that's what he's doing, then that communicates a tremendous amount of love.
Right. And it also, to kind of jump on top of that, it also shows a remarkable amount of wisdom too. Because we oftentimes will ask for one thing, God doesn't give us that, he gives us something else, and we think about God. What do we think about God at that point? That he didn't hear us, or that he's maybe even more devious than that. What is he? He's willfully, what's that?
He's let us down.
He's let us down, or he's willfully holding something back from us. And that's kind of the beauty of the phrase in the Sermon on the Mount, where he says, you're not going to ask him for a bread and he'll give you a stone, or he'll give you a scorpion. That's not the way that God operates. If you ask for something, he's going to give you what you need instead of necessarily what you want. So when I say the phrase, he does what he wants, the kind of the byproduct of that is not just he does what he wants, but he doesn't always do what we want. And I think both of those are important to understand in this context. Somebody have any thoughts or comments on verse 17? Verse 18 is equally as eloquent. In verse 18 he says, in the exercise of his will he brought us forth by the word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. The very first thing he mentions here is he mentions in the exercise of his will. What does he mean when he says that? The exercise of his will.
He chose.
What's that?
He chose.
He chose to do that. I thought you said each of us chose to do that. Right. He chose to do that, exactly. What else does it mean when he says in the exercise of his will? He brought us forth by the word of truth.
Still wants him to execute.
Right. He is the one that has ultimate authority. His rule and his power reign supreme. Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, he has the ability to do it.
Right.
He has the motive to do it and the power to execute it. And that communicates a lot of attributes about God right there.
Right. It does communicate a lot about who he is. And I think what Paul mentioned was kind of what I was getting at. He has the ability to do it. What is it that he has the ability to do according to this passage? What does he say right after that?
Bring us forth by the word of truth.
Right, bring us forth by the word of truth. And that's a very important passage to understand, because when he says bring us forth by the word of truth, what does he say when he says that? The nature is, or the byproduct of that is he's not bringing us forth by anything else. But what is that thing that's bringing us forth? I'll just...
plan that he has given us.
Right, the plan that he has given to us. I'll just ask the direct question. What does he mean by the word of truth?
It's the gospel. It's Romans 1:16.
Exactly. It's Romans 1:16. It's Romans 10:17. Faith comes by hearing, hearing by the word of God. This destroys Calvinism. That's a very important kind of point to bring up in this, is that it's not brought about by any kind of divine intervention. It's not as if all of a sudden this supernatural force just comes into your heart and creates something. He brings us forth by the word of truth so that we would be a kind of first fruits among his creatures. What does he mean by first fruits among his creatures? What's that?
We're the priorities, spiritual priorities.
Right, we are the spiritual priorities, yeah. Let me ask you this, who is his primary audience in this passage? All right, what's his primary audience in James overall? Jewish Christians, exactly. So what does he mean when he says kind of first fruits among his creatures? Right, they were supposed to kind of be the first, or right, when it comes to sacrifice, they were supposed to give the first.
Yeah, they'll be the first.
Right, they'll be the first, right. I'm just talking it through with you. Yeah. If his audience is Messianic Jews, what does it mean when he says for their first fruits among his creatures?
The best. They would be the best, the most perfect, if they followed the plan. He didn't.
Maybe. I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think we'd have to discuss a little bit more, and we'd have to have some coffee. I think that's always the fruit of good Bible study. But yeah, I see a little bit of what you're talking about. Zach, go ahead.
I think it's just the idea that the Feast of First Fruits was the feast that was right before the big harvest. And so he's telling them, look, you are the first fruits of what God is about to do for his kingdom. So these Jewish Christians, the gospel historically went to the Jews first.
Right.
So they are just the the tip of all of this, of what's about to happen in the world of the Gentiles.
Right. That's exactly what it talks about, and that's why I kind of disagree with what Debbie said. Is we tend to look at it as having some really kind of deep spiritual meaning in it. That's a temptation for all of us. But I think he's being very literal. This is literally the first fruits of the harvest. Paul would talk about, I think in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he would talk about how they're the first fruits in Achaia or in Asia. He talks about other people being the first fruits, I think, of Galatia. And so this idea of first fruits is not some kind of deep spiritual meaning. It literally just means they're the first ones there. And so when he ascribes this to Jewish Christians, he talks about the gospel going to the Jews first and then also to the Gentiles. You see that theme all throughout the book of Romans. You see that theme all throughout the book of Acts. What happens in Acts chapter 13? Paul and, I think, Barnabas are standing there talking to the Jews. The Jews reject him. What did Paul and Barnabas then do? Right, they shake the dust off their feet and they say, from now on we are turning to the Gentiles. Now the Gentiles' door was opened up 3 chapters earlier, but now that's where their attention is going towards first. If you remember in Acts chapter 8, Acts chapter 9, God says that Paul is going to be my witness in Judea and then to Samaria, then to the ends of the earth. Or actually, that's in Acts chapter 1. So it always begins with the Jews and then extends outward to them. And I think that's what James is talking about here in James chapter 1, kind of being a first fruits among his creatures. But he also talks about, I think here in verse 18, this idea of a new birth. And this is a theme that's prevalent all throughout Scripture when he talks about, this idea of a new birth. What does that mean when he says a new birth? You kind of have a very similar idea in this passage. What does he mean when he says, what do we mean when we talk about a new birth? Right, you're reborn spiritually, exactly. The Jews were born once, more or less, because they were Jews. They had the understanding of God. So when he talks about this idea of a new birth, he's kind of talking about it in this messianic Jewish sense, where you're taking everything you've learned, but there's a new spiritual component to that. There's a whole new covenant, all this type of stuff. How does Paul talk about the new birth? Romans chapter 8, verse 11, he talks about kind of the spirit idea.
I was thinking right before that in Romans chapter 6. He points out, you crucified the old man. Mm-hmm. You crucified that, and you have been risen. You rise to walk in newness of life. That's a new birth happening there, a regeneration happening there at that point. So this new creation, as you put in Galatians 6, that's the idea of that right here.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, there's probably 1,000 places where Paul talks about the new birth. But you're right, Romans 6 is one of the more obvious ones, Romans 8 is one of the more obvious ones. But it all goes back to this idea of a rebirth according to the gospel, according to obedience. That's his primary idea there, Romans chapter 8, verse 11. When Jesus talks in John chapter 3, verse 3 to Nicodemus, he says that you must be born again. What does he mean according to that? When he says you must be born again? He's not talking about going into your mother's womb and being born again. That's the actual question Nicodemus asks. Right, it's a spiritual thing. It's a new understanding. It's a new way of life. It's kind of tooling your thinking. Peter addresses much the same type of idea there in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 through 5. What's he getting at here in James chapter 1? Because when you look at verses 12 down through verse 15, which talks about the nature of sin, the nature of temptation, and then he discusses 17 through 18, which talks about the nature of goodness, it's all kind of one continuous theme. What is he addressing there in those 7, 8 verses? And that's why do not be deceived is kind of the linchpin verse in all of this. What is he trying to get us to understand?
He's trying to get them to understand the difference between carnality and spiritualness, and having that sin from one to the other.
Right.
And that God is the linchpin that provides that.
That's my word. You can't use it.
I know.
Yeah. Okay. I use Paul's words all the time. But yeah, it's about moving from carnality to spirituality, right? And kind of verse 16, as you mentioned, well, Jesus is the linchpin and all of it, but it's rearranging your thinking. Instead of thinking in terms of carnality, it's in terms of spirituality. There's another big reorganization of thinking that he's trying to get us to think about. Yes, Bruce?
Where man is born with the nature of the flesh, preferring the things of nature. So before we can prefer the things of the spirit, we must be reborn to a new nature.
Right. To a newborn, you have to be reborn again into a completely different nature. And that's, as we mentioned, it's not something supernatural that you just kind of overpower it, but it comes, as he mentioned here, the word of truth, understanding, reasoning, obedience, all is a part of that. Yeah. What else is he trying to get us to think about? Where is he trying to get our focus on?
I think he's trying to tell, like you mentioned, he's talking to the newest converts. I mean, we're talking an early epistle. So, these people are starting to feel their way with forming the church and what it means to be a follower of Christ versus just a Jew. And so James is laying out sort of the subtext here of, you're going through a new birth. You're sort of experiencing this transition from what you used to think how God acted and how you now think God acts, because you understand more what Christianity is now. But also understand that God is the same all the time. You're not serving a new God now.
Right.
God is always the same God, but you have to understand exactly what God is and what He is doing and how His plan works into what you used to be as a Jew and what you now are as a Christian.
Yeah, and there's a lot in what you just said, especially when you consider, as we've talked about several times over the course of this class, how James doesn't parrot, because that demeans it, but he kind of retools a whole lot of things or uses a lot of statements that Jesus would make in terms of the Sermon on the Mount. Takes a lot of Jesus' teachings and kind of applies them to this category. But when you think about the audience that he's dealing with, I think you're exactly right. He's trying to get them to put their focus off of themselves, off of religious systems, and on towards God. That's the big thing that he's trying to get us to. And all of James chapter 1 kind of goes towards that idea. How do we mold ourselves in the image of God? How do we look towards God? And that would be especially important to his audience, because what relationship do the Jews have with God in the first century? Think about it. The temple had been destroyed in 606, 590, or 587. It's been destroyed. There's 200 years, or there's 70 years of exile. Then you have the remnant returning, and then you have 400 years of silence. So what kind of understanding did Jews have about God at that point?
A few kernels of truth amongst a lot of misconceptions.
Right, a few kernels of truth amongst a lot of misconceptions. That's a good way to put it. What else is their understanding of God? Who do they look to as their leaders?
I'm going to say at that point, they didn't have a good understanding.
Exactly. I would agree with that. Rarely I would agree with what you said, but yes, I agree with that. Yeah.
What they knew was through the prophets.
Well, a lot of it's through the prophets also.
Abraham, Moses.
Right. And that's who they revere, and that's kind of what Stephen brings up in Acts chapter 7. But what was their understanding of God? Who was teaching them these things? The religious leaders, exactly, who were so far removed from what God was that he didn't resemble them in any shape, form, or fashion. So their faith was not necessarily as much in God as understanding him personally, as much as it was religious systems, as much as it was, religious leaders. So there's a whole lot of disattachment to them. So it's in the Jews, for lack of a better phrase of nature, to look towards more carnal things, is what Paul addresses a little bit in Colossians 2, as we'll discuss in the lesson today, but more and less about God. Their faith was in more carnal things instead of more godly things. And so I think when you look at James chapter 1, what he's trying to get us at is a lot of what Dustin mentioned earlier. You need to retool your thinking towards God. Look towards him instead of these more carnal things that we're familiar with. Start putting him first in all this episode. Let me have any thoughts or comments, or was that just completely way off?
During this time of persecution, a lot of the less grounded Christians were going back into the old practices,
Right.
which eventually they would have to cover. So he was trying to reground during this time of persecution.
Right. Yeah, that's true. There is a lot of similarities between Judaism and Catholicism. Maybe not necessarily in terms of doctrine, but there is a lot of functional relationship between them. But you're right. They kind of go back towards systems. We want to find this kind of religious ideal that we can go to instead of looking towards God for everything.
Well, and they would be less persecuted if they go back to the old ways.
In some ways, yeah. Of course, you amp it up 20 years in the future, and Jews are being persecuted just as much as the Christians are. But you're right. For a short period of time, it's better to be a Jew than it is to be a Christian. I would agree with that, yeah. When you look at James chapter 1, especially in verses 12 down to verse 18, and that's why I kind of want to take these together, it's all about retooling our understanding of God. It's about retooling our relationship with him. When you look at James chapter 4, I think this is where you see the similarity in this chapter. In James chapter 4, starting in verse 13, this is where the dialogue or the conversation kind of tends to amp up in James's teaching. He says in verse 13, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city, spend a year there, engage in business, make a profit. Yet you don't know what your life will be like tomorrow. You're just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, all such boasting is evil. Therefore, to one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is sin. Who is James' audience here in James chapter 4, 13 through 17?
The material minded.
Right, the material-minded, which I found a fantastic graphic to illustrate this. Yeah, the material-minded. But here's a trick question, or here's kind of taking a step further. Is he only speaking to the material-minded? Because when we think of that, we think of this. My mind is on greed. My mind is on, carnality. Is that his only audience here?
But I think he's also talking to people like we just talked about, the people that are still focused on the ritualistic Jewishness of their life instead of the spiritual aspect that they were supposed to be more focused on in their new Christian life.
Yeah, I think religious legalism can be a part of it. I think you can kind of put that in there. I don't know if I would say that's a whole different audience, but I agree with that. Probably religious legalism to a certain extent.
It's just the day in, day out, Monday, go about your business, not everything.
You say that like a typical government employee. Yeah, it's the everyday mundaneness, it's the kind of going on, it's the everyday aspects of life. But there's an aspect specifically in verses 13 through 17 that he's addressing. What is that one aspect that he's addressing? Very prominent in materialism, carnality.
Pride.
Right, pride. What do you mean by that? You were right. I was just kind of your biggest fan there for a second. Yeah, he is talking about pride. What kind of pride, though? I think arrogance is probably a good word to put with it, too.
Well, it would be self-sufficiency. It's the idea that I can supply anything I need, and that would necessarily bleed over into my spiritual life as well.
Right. It's the idea that I'm self-sufficient, that I don't need God, which comes into play in James chapter 1. Sin is God's fault, but all the blessings are my benefit. I'm doing this myself. God's bringing all the negative things, therefore I don't need Him. And he's attacking that same mentality here in James chapter 4. When he says here in verse 13, come now you who say, he's not just addressing people who are outright rich or greedy or stuff like that, although certainly that's in view here. He's talking to anybody who says, I can do these things myself and I don't need God. You can see that with verse 14, or at the end of verse 13. Today we'll go to such and such a city, we'll spend a year there, we will engage in business, we will make a profit. Who is the primary subject in verse 13? Who's the focal point of verse 13? Or what's the focal point? We, exactly, or I. Yes, we or I. I'm going to do this, I'm going to go there, I'm going to do that. And to be fair, there is a lot of things under his control. He can go to another place, he can engage in business, probably good at it by this point, he can have money, but what is he forgetting in all of this? Which is where verse 14 pops up.
Only if God wills.
Only if God wills, exactly. What he's missing there in verse 14 is, you don't know what your life will be like tomorrow. So in other words, you can control your intent, but you don't really know if any of this stuff is actually going to take place.
Yeah, I would probably nuance that a little bit further by saying the fact that death is at your door. And you will give an account of your soul one day. So how are you living your life in the meantime? Because that was the exact point that Jesus makes.
Right.
Whenever he says, here's an example of a man who he ran out of space in his barn, so he says, what am I going to do? Well, I guess I'll build bigger barns.
Right.
And the conclusion of that was what? You're a fool. Why? Because you built bigger barns? No, because now God requires of you what you cannot provide because you weren't rich with God.
And I think that's the fundamental problem. People look at this in James chapter 4 and they say, well, you should just not ever plan. Well, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes is replete with the idea that you should always plan. There's not a problem with that. But you should always plan with what in mind? With God or with your eternity. Because the ultimate thing that we need to be storing up for ourselves is, as Zach mentioned, riches in heaven, not riches on earth. And so that's the kind of the linchpin, to use the famous word today. That's the linchpin in all of this. What does he say about our nature there in verse 14? You don't know what your life will be like tomorrow, and you are just a what? Yeah, you're just a vapor that appears for a short time and then vanishes away. The irony of all of this is we as humans like to make plans, years in advance, 10, 20, 30, 50 years in advance. Zach's a financial planner, so he deals with this all day. But we like to plan for our retirement, and yet we really don't even know what. We don't even know if we'll live to tomorrow, much less 50 years from now. And so what he's trying to do to us is not, get us all be pessimistic and, brooding about our life, but to realize that there are a lot of things that are not in our control, and I would argue the biggest things that are not in our control. Somebody else, any thoughts or comments on that part?
The opposite of that is not doing anything at all.
Well, that's true.
Which is just a bump.
Yeah.
So there has to be a trade-off somewhere between the two, and that's what we typically do.
Right.
So we plan enough that we can be secure for, years in advance, but we're not so deficient in planning that we just live in the streets.
Right, exactly. We should plan, you're right. Not to the point that we ignore God, but we should also not, this is going to sound really bad unless I phrase it right. We should also not have blindness so much that we become a bum and we end up living in the streets. There has to be the right amount of planning, but it has to be equal with a huge amount of faith. It's a horrible illustration, but you kind of get what I'm going at with
Our
that.
plans really should focus on
Right.
every day you got, but part of that is being responsible for us.
Right.
You can't let the desire to acquire things become a
Right.
religion.
Which is the point of
You bump that against what God wants us to do.
Right, which is the point of Ecclesiastes chapter 12. The point is not, just don't do anything because tomorrow we die. The point is you need to do things as much as you can right now, but remember that we're all going to die. Keep eternity in view. Yeah. Zach, go ahead.
I think that's precisely what he was talking about, because in the statement, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town, spend a year there, trade, make profit. Nothing in there is spiritual in what he mentions.
Right.
So I really just think the point is not, you can plan the next 100 years if you want to. I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is the fact that he points out, what is your life? It's a vapor. At any point, your life could end, and you have to now give an account to God. So where does he factor into this?
Right.
Keep him at the forefront. Plan, that's great. Plan your spiritual life, plan your financial life, plan everything. But understand that at any point, just because you planned it doesn't mean that you'll make it that far.
That's true, and sometimes we're arrogant enough to think that because I've planned it, it's naturally going to happen, then everything can change, and there's a lot of stock market people that say that. But the temptation is, as we have pictured here with this, whoever this woman is, the temptation is to think about it only in terms of financial matters. Can we do this with other things besides finances? How else can we do this? You can, right, that's
It's
fair.
a place,
Right.
it could be the acquisition of communication
It can be a house, it can be the acquisition of a degree, it can be your career, it can be, it can be any kind of thing that takes precedence over God, exactly, right?
Well, we're supposed to be good stewards of our money and
Right.
the things that we own and stuff like that. I think what God's saying here is don't put your faith in the dollar
Right.
bill or your house or your car or whatever, because that would go hungry for one thing. And, but, it's not saying you can't have these things.
Right.
Just don't put your faith in them.
Right.
Because put your faith in them, the next thing you know, you're worshiping them, and they become number one, God become number 2 or 3 or 4 on the list. And pretty soon he's out.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And I would say too, when you couple this with what we're talking about in James chapter 1, look to God as the giver of all things. And if your finances are bad, don't take that to mean that God's against you in some way. Maybe he's, well, you can go off on that all you want. Let's look at James chapter 1, because there's a few verses I think that kind of speak to this same idea, not in what we just mentioned. But when you look at James chapter 1 and verses 9 through 11, you see the same type of idea prevalent in this first chapter again. In verse 9, he says, "But the brother of humble circumstances is to glory in his high position. The rich man is to glory in his humiliation, because like flowery grass he will pass away." So you see that same idea of vapor, flowering grass. "For the sun rises with the scorching wind, withers the grass. If flower falls off, the beauty of its appearance is destroyed. So too the rich man in the midst of his pursuits will fade away." What does James chapter 1, verses 9 through 11 have to do with James chapter 4? What is he trying to get the rich man specifically in James chapter 1 to understand?
Well, as you mentioned before, a lot of the writing in James parallels what Jesus teaches, especially in the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus teaches us there in chapter 6 to store our treasure in heaven, where moth cannot corrupt and where thieves cannot break in and steal.
Right.
So we can do the things that we need to do to live our life in a physical way, but we also got to make sure that that doesn't detract us from keeping our treasures in an eternal place, that once all this physical stuff is gone, we've still got that to fall back on.
Right. The point of James chapter 1 that he's getting at is in verses 9 to 11 is that exact point. It's the idea that you know that your treasures will eventually pass away. Your soul, however, will not. Your soul is eternal. And people tend to look at these passages and say, well, you can't store up for yourself riches on earth because those are going to go away. And that's true. But ultimately, when you extrapolate it to an even bigger span, everything we do on this earth will eventually pass away. If you break every sports record, if you win 100 Oscars, at some point all of those things are going to pass away. So the point is to focus on things that are eternal in nature. Go back to Isaiah chapter 14. I think Isaiah makes a great passage here, a great point here. Not about Satan, but about Babylon. Common misunderstanding. Isaiah chapter 14, starting in verse 12. Isaiah chapter 14, starting in verse 12. Isaiah writes, "How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning." That's where people get Lucifer. That's where people think he's talking to Satan here. He's not. You can back up a few verses and see he's talking about Babylon. "But O star of the morning, son of the dawn, you have been cut down to the earth, you who have weakened the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Nevertheless, you will be thrust down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit. Those who see you will gaze at you. They will ponder over you, saying, is this the man who made the earth tremble, the man who shook kingdoms?" Was Babylon like that? The city of Babylon, the nation of Babylon, was it like what he talks in there in verses 12 through 15? Got two nods, so that's good enough to keep going. Yes, Babylon was massive. Nebuchadnezzar shows up in Jerusalem's doorstep, annihilates the city, carries all the captivities away. What happens to Nebuchadnezzar, though, specifically in the book of Daniel? He had this attitude. Remember, he's walking around on top of his house, looks at all the stuff. What's that? God humbled him, but what did he say before God humbled him? Do you remember? Yes. Yeah, it's the epitome of James chapter 4. Right. It's the epitome of James 4, verses 11 through 16. Look at all the things that I've done, and immediately what happens at that point? But he didn't die.
He essentially acts like a cow for a while.
Yeah, he doesn't essentially. I guess he becomes a cow more or less. He grows long hair. His nails grow long. He ends up eating grass for a period of years, I think it is, and then all of a sudden he comes to his senses, which I'm sure that was a fun moment of realization. But he then begins to realize that God is the one that's in control and he's not. And so you kind of see that taking place. There's this great story about Antiochus Epiphanes in 2 Maccabees that says much the same type of thing. He comes in and he makes a big boast about himself, and then he's eventually carried away in a litter because he's so desecrated by the Maccabean revolt. So when you look at James chapter 4, all of it has to do with keeping eternity in mind. But then verse 16 pops up. In James chapter 4, verse 16, verse 17, this famous verse where he says, "Therefore to one who knows the right thing to do and does it not, to him it is sin." What does he mean in the context? Because we pluck verse 17 out of context all the time and use it for this, that, everything.
The sin of omission, that we are
It's spiritual.
guilty of frequently, just.
Right.
You know what is wrong.
Right.
God has told you, and
Where did you hear that? Micah 6:8. I don't know where you got that from. Somebody should preach a sermon on that. Yeah.
you know, to do justice and those kind of things. And you don't have an excuse of ignorance.
Right. You certainly don't have an excuse of ignorance.
If there are right things that you are just turning your back on, that's sin.
Right. Paul, go ahead.
I forgot about that.
Yeah.
You take place.
That's true too. I mean, that's certainly true that there is laziness as sin. I think sins of omission come into play too. But what does this have to do with what we've talked about today? To him who knows what to do and to do it not is sin. How does that connect with what we talked about?
Well, it's not so much the fact that you are trying to make money and trying to provide food. It's that we got to realize that God's power. And even if we give him credit, all credit for it, we also have to realize what we do with it.
Right.
You know, yeah, we store it up,
Right.
but to do right is to do it for those who need it.
Right. But to kind of pull that back even further, to live life with a complete disregard for God, because we know that he exists, to live life with a disregard to him means that our lives are ultimately lived in sin because we don't care about him, we don't obey him, we don't listen to him. I think that's kind of at least the big one.
Right, I think you're spot on with that because we've got to be extremely careful what we're doing here. If you take it out of context, you're going to end up in hot water. So the idea is, I think, exactly what you said, is that God has given us commands on how we should act towards Him and towards others. When we follow those commands, we know what is good and we are doing it.
Right.
When we stop doing that, we commit sin.
Right.
We shouldn't make the passage read what it doesn't say.
That's true, yes, good point. All right, we will pick up with James 1 next week.